Women, what's something worse than cheating that you discovered about your partner? I was supposed to be at work when I saw my husband Tom get into his car at 2 in the afternoon. He'd called in sick that morning with a stomach bug, but here he was walking just fine to his car with a duffel bag. We'd been married for 3 years and lived in our suburban house for 2. Tom worked in accounting and never took sick days unless he was really dying. Something felt wrong, so I decided to follow him. I kept 3 cars between us as he drove across town. He wasn't heading to the doctor or the pharmacy. After 20 minutes, he pulled into an apartment complex I'd never seen before. Canyon Ridge Apartments near the University District. He parked and grabbed his bag like he'd done this 100 times before. My chest felt tight as I watched him unlock apartment 67 with his own key. Not knocking or waiting for someone to answer. His own key on his keyring right next to our house key. I sat in my car for 5 minutes trying to breathe normally. There had to be an explanation that wasn't him cheating on me. I waited until he'd been inside for 15 minutes before I got out of my car. The door wasn't fully closed. Tom must have been in a hurry and didn't pull it tight. I pushed the door slowly and stepped into the apartment. The first thing I saw was our couch. The exact same gray sectional we'd bought last year from Costco. Same throw pillows. Same blanket my mom had crocheted for us draped over the back. Everything was the same. Our TV stand. Our bookshelf. The apartment layout was identical to our house's first floor, just compressed into less space. Even our family photos were hanging on the walls. "Tom?" I called out. The footsteps stopped. I heard him say something, but not to me. He was talking in a higher voice like he was imitating someone. Then his regular voice responded. A whole conversation between Tom and someone who wasn't there. I walked toward the bedroom, and that's when I saw the dining room table. It was set for 5 people. 5 plates with food on them. A high chair at one end with baby food in a bowl. A booster seat with dinosaur nuggets cut up small. Tom came out of the bedroom and froze when he saw me. But what made me step backward wasn't his surprised face. It was the wig he was wearing. A long blonde wig styled exactly like my hair. He was wearing one of my dresses too. The blue one I'd worn to his office party last month. "Becky, I can explain." That's when I noticed the other wigs on the couch. A small black one that looked like a little boy's haircut. A brown one with pigtails. A gray one styled like Tom's mother wore her hair. A bald cap with liver spots drawn on like his father's head. "Tom, what is this?" He sat down hard on our duplicate couch, still wearing my dress and wig. He looked small and broken in a way I'd never seen before. I wanted to practice being a family. The kind we talked about having. 2 kids, maybe 3. My parents visiting for Sunday dinner. There was a dog bed in the corner. Food and water bowls with Max written on them. No actual dog, but all the stuff for one. "We can still have that family," I said carefully. "No, we can't. The fertility tests were hard, but we have options." He shook his head and pulled off the blonde wig. His own hair was thin underneath. Thinner than I'd noticed before. "It's not about fertility, Becky." "Then what?" He stood up and walked to the hallway closet. Inside were more wigs. More costumes. A pregnancy belly that strapped on. Baby clothes in different sizes. Halloween costumes for children aged 2 through 10. I planned their whole lives. Emma would be 7 now if we'd gotten pregnant when we first started trying. James would be 5. The baby would be 18 months. He knew their names, their ages, their birthdays that never happened. "How long have you been coming here?" 6 months. Since the diagnosis. "What diagnosis?" Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Tom's hands started shaking, and he sat down hard on the couch, still wearing my blue dress. He pulled at the blonde wig until it came off and dropped it on the floor between us. His real hair underneath looked thinner than I remembered. He pressed his palms against his knees like he was trying to stop them from trembling. I couldn't move from where I stood by the dining table with its 5-place settings. The baby food in the high chair was starting to separate, and the dinosaur nuggets on the booster seat looked cold and dry. Tom opened his mouth twice before any words came out. He told me he had Huntington's disease. The name meant nothing to me at first. It sounded like something from a history textbook, but the way he said it made my legs feel weak. I walked over to the duplicate couch and sat down on the opposite end from him because I needed to sit, but I couldn't be close to him right then. I told him he needed to explain everything right now, or I was walking out that door, and I meant it. Tom nodded, and his hands were still shaking when he started talking. He said he'd noticed problems with his coordination about a year ago. Small things like dropping his coffee cup or having trouble with buttons on his shirts. Then his mood started changing in ways that scared him. He'd get angry over nothing or feel sad for no reason he could name. He researched his symptoms online and kept finding the same disease name. Huntington's. He made an appointment with a specialist 6 months ago, and the neurologist ran tests. The genetic test came back positive. Tom had been living with this diagnosis for half a year while I had no idea anything was wrong. I asked him why he didn't tell me right away. Why he let me think everything was fine while he was dealing with this alone. Tom said he needed time to process what it meant for our future. His voice got quieter when he explained that Huntington's is genetic. Any children we had would have a 50% chance of inheriting the disease from him. 50%. Like flipping a coin to decide if our kid would get sick and die young. He said the apartment became his way of experiencing the family life he believed we could never have now. I stared at him sitting there in my dress, and I didn't recognize my own husband. Tom stood up and walked to the bedroom. He came back carrying a black notebook with a worn cover. He sat down closer to me this time and opened it to the first page. Inside were lists and schedules and details written in Tom's neat handwriting. Emma's page showed her birthday as March 15th. She would be 7 years old now if we'd gotten pregnant when we first started trying. Tom had written that she loved reading and wanted to be a veterinarian. Her favorite color was purple. She was shy around new people but brave when it mattered. He turned the page and showed me James. 5 years old with a birthday in July. James liked dinosaurs and building blocks. He was afraid of the dark but loved thunderstorms. The detail made my skin crawl because it showed how deep into this fantasy Tom had gone. There were pages for baby Sophia, who would be 18 months old. Her first words, her favorite foods, the mobile that would hang over her crib. Tom had planned their entire lives down to the colleges they might attend and the careers they might choose. He'd invented personalities and preferences and fears for children who never existed and never would. I looked around the apartment again and saw it differently now. The dog bed in the corner wasn't just strange. It was part of the complete family Tom had built in his head. I pointed at it and asked about the dog. Tom's face got red and he admitted he came here 3 or 4 times a week to have dinner with the family. He would set out food on all 5 plates. Then he'd put on the different wigs and talk in different voices. The blonde wig so he could be me, the small black wig for James, the brown pigtails for Emma. He'd have whole conversations with himself pretending to be our family eating dinner together. Sometimes he'd pretend to help with homework or give baths to the imaginary kids. He'd even stay overnight sometimes and call me with lies about working late or meeting friends. The sick days and the evening errands and all the times he said he needed space. He was coming here to play house with people who didn't exist. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The financial question hit me then, and I asked how much this apartment cost. Tom looked down at the notebook in his hands. He said the rent was $1,500 a month, plus he'd been buying duplicate furniture to match our real house. All the clothes and toys and props for his fantasy family. He estimated he'd spent close to $20,000 from our joint savings over the past 6 months. $20,000. Our money that we'd been saving for actual children or a bigger house or emergencies. He'd stolen it to fund his delusion without telling me. I felt my anger building hot and sharp in my chest. He'd been lying to me multiple times every single week for half a year. Every sick day was a lie. Every late night at work was a lie. Every weekend errand that took 3 hours was him coming here to pretend we had the family we'd always talked about. He stole my right to know about his diagnosis. He stole our money. He stole months of time when we could have been facing this together and making real decisions about our real future. Tom started crying then. Not quiet tears, but full sobs that shook his shoulders. He said he knew it was wrong, but he couldn't stop himself. The apartment was the only place he felt normal instead of broken and dying. He said he was protecting me from the pain of knowing what was coming. I told him he just made everything worse by lying. Protection that came through lies wasn't protection at all. It was control. It was him deciding what I could handle without giving me any choice in the matter. I asked about his symptoms and what we were actually dealing with. Tom wiped his face with the back of his hand and explained that Huntington's causes progressive loss of motor control. His hands would get worse. His balance would fail. Eventually, he wouldn't be able to walk or feed himself. The disease also caused cognitive decline and personality changes. His memory would go. His ability to think clearly would fade. He'd become someone else entirely. Most people lived 10 to 20 years after symptoms started showing. Tom was already in the early stages. There was no cure, no treatment that would stop it, just medications to manage symptoms as they got worse and worse until he died. The reality of what he was telling me started to sink in slowly like cold water filling up a room. My husband was dying, not suddenly but slowly over years, and he'd been dealing with it completely alone while pretending everything was fine. While I complained about work stress or worried about what to make for dinner, he'd been carrying this weight by himself. Part of me wanted to hold him and tell him we'd face it together. But my sympathy crashed hard against my fury that he'd made this choice for both of us without giving me any say. He'd decided I couldn't handle the truth. He'd decided our marriage couldn't survive his diagnosis. He'd decided to lie and hide and build a fake life instead of trusting me with the real one. I stood up from the couch and told him I needed time to think. I was going home and he needed to stay here or go somewhere else, but I couldn't be around him right now. Tom begged me not to leave him alone in the apartment. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I walked to the door and looked back one more time at the staged dining table and the wigs on the couch and my husband sitting there in my dress. Then I left and pulled the door shut behind me. I got in my car and drove home on autopilot. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The 20-minute drive felt like it took both forever and no time at all. When I pulled into our driveway, I sat there for a minute staring at our house. Our real house that Tom had copied into that apartment like he was building a dollhouse version of our life. I went inside and straight to the office where we kept our filing cabinet. I pulled out the last 6 months of bank statements and credit card bills and spread them across the desk. There they were. Cash withdrawals of $200 here, $300 there, always from different ATMs around town. Charges to furniture stores I didn't remember us visiting. A payment to Canyon Ridge Apartments that I'd somehow missed, or Tom had hidden in the online banking. He'd been so careful about it. Small enough amounts that I wouldn't notice any single transaction. But when I added it all up with a calculator, my hands were shaking. So bad I had to do it 3 times to make sure. $20,000, maybe more. He'd stolen from us for 6 months while looking me in the eye every single day and lying. I wanted to throw something or scream or break every dish in the kitchen. Instead, I just sat there at the desk with all the statements in front of me and felt cold all over. Around midnight, I called Bianca because I couldn't be alone with this anymore. She answered on the second ring even though it was late, and I could hear her boyfriend in the background asking who was calling. I told her I needed her and she said she'd be there in 15 minutes. She showed up in sweatpants and a jacket thrown over her pajama shirt. I let her in and we sat on the couch and I told her everything. The apartment, the wigs, the fake family dinners, Tom's diagnosis that I didn't even fully understand yet, the money he'd spent. Bianca just listened and didn't interrupt once. When I finally stopped talking, she pulled me into a hug and I started crying for real. Not the angry crying from the apartment, but the kind where you can't breathe right and your whole body shakes. She held me and said it was okay to be mad and sad at the same time. She said Tom's illness explained why he did it, but it didn't make the lying okay. I had every right to be furious with him for hiding this, and for stealing our money, and for making all these choices without me. We sat there until almost 2 in the morning when I heard Tom's car pull up outside. Bianca squeezed my hand and asked if I wanted her to stay, but I told her I needed to deal with this. She hugged me one more time and left through the back door so she wouldn't have to see Tom. He came in through the front and stopped when he saw me still awake on the couch. We just looked at each other for a long moment. Then he grabbed a pillow and blanket from the hall closet and made up the couch without either of us saying anything. I went upstairs to our bedroom and got in bed, but I didn't sleep. I could hear him moving around downstairs for a while before it got quiet. The next morning, I came down and found him already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. I poured myself one and sat across from him. The silence felt thick and awful between us. Finally, I told him we needed to see his neurologist together. I needed to understand what we were actually dealing with, and I wasn't going to let him handle his medical care alone anymore, since he'd proven he couldn't be trusted to be honest. Tom nodded and pulled out his phone. He called the office right there and asked to add me to his next appointment. The receptionist said his next visit was in 3 days, and Tom said that was fine. He gave them my information and hung up. That was it. We didn't talk about anything else. Over the next 3 days, I went to work and came home and spent my evenings researching Huntington's disease on my laptop. Every article I read made me more scared. The disease was brutal and there was no cure. It would take away Tom's ability to walk and talk and think clearly. The involuntary movements would get worse until he couldn't control his body at all. He'd need full-time care eventually. And the genetic part was what really got me. Any kids we had would have a 50% chance of getting the same disease. 50%. Like flipping a coin to decide if your child would die young from a horrible illness. I read about genetic testing and pre-implantation diagnosis and adoption, and I felt overwhelmed by all of it. Tom had been living with this knowledge for 6 months. 6 months of knowing his future and ours and carrying it alone while I complained about my job or worried about what to make for dinner. Part of me understood better why he'd created that apartment, but I was still so angry about the lying. On the day of the appointment, we drove to the neurologist's office in silence. Dr. Giles McNamara was younger than I expected, maybe in his 40s with gray starting at his temples. He shook both our hands and we sat down in his office. He pulled up Tom's file on his computer and started explaining the test results. Tom had the adult onset form of Huntington's with a CAG repeat count of 42. The doctor said that meant relatively slow progression compared to people with higher counts. But Tom was already showing mild motor issues and some executive function changes. Things like trouble with planning and organization that I'd attributed to work stress. The doctor recommended starting medication right away to help manage symptoms, and he gave us a referral to a genetic counselor to talk about family planning options. I asked about Tom's prognosis and how long we had before things got really bad. Dr. McNamara was honest in a way that made it hard to breathe. He said it varied widely between patients, but Tom likely had 15 to 25 years before severe disability. The disease would gradually take away his coordination first. Then his speech would get harder. His cognitive abilities would decline. Eventually, he'd need full-time care for everything. Hearing it laid out so clinically made it real in a way Tom's explanation in the apartment hadn't. This was actually happening to us. Tom admitted to the doctor that he hadn't told his employer about the diagnosis yet. Dr. McNamara leaned forward and said strongly that Tom needed to disclose so he could access FMLA protections and workplace accommodations. Tom said he was worried about losing respect at work, or maybe even his job. The doctor warned him that trying to hide declining performance would backfire worse than being upfront now. After the appointment, we sat in the car for a few minutes before driving away. I told Tom we needed to talk about the apartment and the money. I wasn't ready to forgive him for lying, but I understood better why he did it. The apartment had to go, though. And he needed to be completely transparent about finances from now on, or I couldn't stay in this marriage. Tom agreed to end the lease, and I told him I was coming with him to talk to the property manager. I wasn't letting him handle anything alone anymore. We drove to Canyon Ridge that afternoon and went to the office. The property manager was a guy named Bo Cannon, with a friendly face that looked confused when Tom said we needed to break the lease. Bo pulled up the file and said Tom had just renewed 2 months ago. Tom explained vaguely about changed circumstances and asked about early termination penalties. Bo said the penalty was 2 months' rent, which came to $3,000. I felt my anger flare up all over again at the financial hole Tom had dug for us. $3,000 we couldn't afford after he'd already spent $20,000 on this fantasy. But we agreed to the terms because what choice did we have? Bo said we had until the end of the month to clear everything out and get him the keys back. I told Tom we needed to get help for this. Professional help because I couldn't process what was happening on my own. He nodded without arguing, and that surprised me more than anything. I called Bianca from the car while Tom drove us home in silence. She picked up on the second ring, and I told her everything about the apartment and the diagnosis, and how I didn't know what to do. She said her cousin had gone through something similar when her husband got sick, and they'd seen a therapist who really helped. His name was Omar Doyle, and he worked with couples dealing with medical stuff and trauma. Bianca texted me his number right away. I called Omar's office the next morning and explained our situation to the receptionist. She put me on hold for a few minutes, then came back and said Omar had a cancellation and could see us in 4 days. I took the appointment and wrote down the address. Tom agreed to go without any pushback, which made me wonder if he was relieved someone else would help carry this weight he'd been holding alone. That evening, Tom was getting water from the kitchen when I heard glass breaking. I walked in and found him staring at the pieces scattered across the floor. He bent down to pick them up, but his hands were shaking and he couldn't quite grab the bigger shards. His fingers kept missing or knocking the glass further away. I watched him try 3 times before his face crumpled with frustration. This was what he'd been hiding. These small moments where his body wouldn't do what his brain told it to do. I got the broom and dustpan without saying anything and swept up the glass while Tom stood there with his hands clenched. He didn't thank me, and I didn't expect him to. We both just pretended it hadn't happened, even though we both knew it had. The next few days felt wrong in ways I couldn't explain. Tom went to work like normal, and I went to my job at the insurance office. But everything was different now. I'd look at him across the dinner table and think about the apartment with the 5 place settings. The imaginary children he'd given names and ages and whole lives. Emma, who would be 7. James, who would be 5. Baby Sophia at 18 months. He'd planned their Halloween costumes and marked their fake birthdays on a calendar. How long would he have kept going to that apartment if I hadn't followed him that day? Would he have told me eventually? Or just kept living this double life where he got to pretend we had the family we'd always wanted? The lying bothered me more than the illness. I could have handled knowing about Huntington's. I would have been scared and sad, but I would have been there with him. Instead, he chose to shut me out and spend our money on a fantasy. I started going through our credit card statements at night after Tom fell asleep. I found charges I'd never paid attention to before. Furniture stores and home goods places, small amounts that didn't seem weird on their own but added up over months. Then I found a card I didn't recognize. It was in Tom's name only, which was strange because we'd always kept our finances joint. I logged into the account using his email and the password he used for everything. There was about $5,000 charged on it. All the same kinds of stores, all the same time period as the other charges. He'd opened a secret credit card to hide the apartment expenses from me. I felt my chest get tight as I scrolled through the transactions. Baby clothes from Target, a crib from Walmart, toys and books and sipster cups. He'd bought everything for children who didn't exist. I confronted him the next morning before work. I showed him the credit card statement on my phone and asked him to explain. Tom's face went pale and he admitted he'd opened the card 6 months ago when he started renting the apartment. He said he was planning to pay it off before I noticed, and he knew it was wrong, but he didn't know what else to do. I told him this was exactly why I couldn't trust him anymore. It wasn't just the apartment or the diagnosis. It was the pattern of hiding things and making decisions that affected both of us without including me. He said he was sorry and he'd close the card and we'd pay it off together. I said sorry wasn't enough this time. He'd broken something between us that I didn't know how to fix. We sat in Omar's waiting room 4 days later, not talking to each other. The office was in a building downtown with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs. Omar came out right at our appointment time. He was maybe 40 with gray hair and kind eyes. He shook both our hands and led us back to his office. The room had 2 couches facing each other and a chair where Omar sat. He asked us to sit wherever we felt comfortable, and Tom and I ended up on opposite couches. Omar started by asking us each to explain why we were there. I went first and talked about finding the apartment and learning about Tom's diagnosis, and discovering all the money he'd spent. I told Omar about the lying and the secret credit card, and how I didn't know if I could stay married to someone who hid so much from me. My voice stayed steady the whole time, which surprised me. Tom went next, and his voice cracked right away. He talked about the Huntington's diagnosis and how scared he was. He said he felt broken and didn't want me to see him that way. He thought if he could process everything alone first, then he could present it to me in a way that wouldn't hurt so much. But instead, he got stuck in the apartment fantasy and couldn't find a way out. He said he knew he'd destroyed my trust and didn't blame me for being angry. Omar listened to both of us without interrupting. When we finished, he said we were dealing with multiple crises at once, medical and financial and relational. He said we needed to address them one at a time in a way that made sense instead of trying to fix everything at once. Omar asked Tom why he chose to handle his diagnosis alone instead of telling me right away. Tom said he didn't want to burden me with it. He didn't want to see pity in my eyes every time I looked at him. He thought if he could just work through his feelings first, then he could be strong enough to help me work through mine. But the more time passed, the harder it got to tell me. And the apartment became this place where he could pretend everything was okay, where he could be the husband and father he'd always wanted to be instead of the sick man he was becoming. Omar asked if Tom understood that by trying to protect me, he'd actually hurt me worse. Tom nodded and said he knew that now, but at the time he convinced himself he was doing the right thing. I told Omar that what hurt most wasn't the diagnosis itself. It was that Tom took away my choice to support him through this. I would have been there for him if he'd let me. We could have faced it together instead of him carrying it alone while lying to me every day. I said I felt like I didn't even know who my husband was anymore. The Tom I thought I married wouldn't have done this. Tom started crying and said he knew he'd destroyed everything. He said he didn't know how to fix what he'd broken, and maybe it was too broken to fix. I didn't say anything because I didn't know the answer. Omar let us sit in the silence for a minute before he spoke again. Omar gave us homework before our next session in a week. He said Tom needed to write out a complete timeline of everything. When his symptoms started and when he got diagnosed and when he rented the apartment and every lie he told along the way. He needed to see it all laid out, so he could understand the full extent of what he'd done. I needed to write about what I needed from Tom to start rebuilding trust. Not what I thought I should need or what seemed reasonable. What I actually needed to feel safe in this marriage again. We both agreed to do the work, though I wasn't sure writing things down would make me feel any better. It felt like putting a band-aid on something that needed stitches. The next day, Tom and I drove to the apartment to start clearing it out. I hadn't been back since the day I found it, and walking through that door again made my stomach hurt. Everything looked different in daylight, more sad than scary. I could see how carefully Tom had arranged everything to match our real home. The couch in the exact same spot, the TV at the same angle. Even the pictures on the walls were hung at the same height. I found a calendar in the kitchen with things written on it in Tom's handwriting. Emma's soccer practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays. James's piano lesson on Wednesdays. Sophia's doctor appointment for her 18-month checkup. He'd created an entire schedule for children who never existed. In a drawer, I found birthday cards he'd written to them. Happy 7th birthday, Emma. You're growing up so fast. I couldn't read the rest. I asked Tom if there was anything from the apartment he wanted to keep. He said no. He needed to let it all go. We started packing up the furniture piece by piece. Tom had bought most of it new or from Facebook Marketplace, so we could sell it or donate it. He handled each item slowly like he was saying goodbye to something precious. The couch where he'd sat with his imaginary family. The dining table where he'd served pretend dinners. The high chair where baby Sophia would never sit. I watched him fold up the small clothes and pack away the toys, and I realized this apartment had meant something to him I couldn't fully understand. It wasn't just a delusion or a lie. It was hope. Twisted and sad and completely wrong, but still hope for the family we'd talked about having since before we got married. The family that Huntingtons had stolen from us before we even had a chance to try. I moved a box of baby clothes to the side and found a manila folder wedged between the wall and a dresser drawer. The label said medical information in Tom's handwriting. Inside were printed articles about IVF and something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. The papers had highlighting and notes in the margins where Tom had calculated costs and success rates. One page showed a clinic in the city that specialized in genetic screening for Huntington's disease. They could test embryos before implantation to make sure we only transferred ones without the gene. Tom had written our names at the top of a cost estimate sheet. $45,000 for one round. No insurance coverage. I held the folder and felt my hands start shaking. He'd researched this months ago and never said a word to me. Tom looked up from the box he was taping and saw what I was holding. His face went pale. I asked him how long he'd known about this option. He said he found out right after his diagnosis. The genetic counselor had explained it during his first appointment. I asked why he never told me we could still have biological children without passing on the disease. Tom said it was too expensive and too much to ask of me. The IVF process was hard on women's bodies with all the hormones and procedures. He didn't want to put me through that when there were no guarantees it would work. I felt my anger come back hot and sharp. He'd decided for both of us again without even asking what I wanted. Maybe I would have said yes to trying IVF. Maybe I would have said the money was worth it or we could have found a way to afford it. But he took that choice away from me, just like he took away my choice to support him through his diagnosis. I told him I was tired of him deciding what I could handle, like I was too weak or stupid to make my own decisions. Tom said he was trying to protect me from disappointment. The success rates weren't great and the process was painful and expensive. He thought he was sparing me from getting my hopes up about something that might not work. I said he didn't get to decide that. Protection felt like control when he did it behind my back. Every time he hid something or made a choice without me, he was treating me like a child instead of his partner. Tom's voice got louder and he said he was dying and trying to figure out how to handle that. He made mistakes because he was scared and didn't know what else to do. I said being scared didn't give him the right to lie to me for 6 months. Being scared didn't mean he got to spend $20,000 of our money on a fake family. Being scared didn't excuse any of it. We stood on opposite sides of the apartment yelling at each other until my throat hurt. Tom said I didn't understand what it was like to know your body was breaking down and there was nothing you could do to stop it. I said he was right that I didn't understand because he never let me try to understand. He kept me locked out of the biggest thing happening in his life. and now he wanted credit for trying to protect me. The protection just made everything worse. It delayed the pain and added betrayal on top of it. Tom sat down hard on the floor and put his head in his hands. He said he knew I was right, but he didn't know how to fix what he'd broken. I told him I needed space and walked out of the apartment. I got in my car and drove without knowing where I was going. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, and I could feel tears on my face, but I didn't remember starting to cry. I drove through neighborhoods I didn't recognize and past parks and shopping centers until an hour had passed. When I came back to the apartment, Tom had kept packing. All the baby clothes were in boxes. The wigs were in garbage bags. He'd taken down the family photos from the walls and stacked them neatly by the door. He looked up when I came in and said he was sorry. Not just sorry for today, but sorry for all of it. Sorry for making choices that affected both of us without including me. Sorry for letting his fear make him selfish. He said he wanted to do better, but he understood if I couldn't trust him anymore. I told him sorry wasn't enough. Words were easy, but I needed to see him actually change how he acted. No more secrets. No more deciding things for me. No more protecting me from information I had the right to know. Tom nodded and said he would try. I said trying wasn't good enough either. He had to actually do it. Over the next week, we went back to the apartment every evening after work to finish clearing it out. Tom had posted the duplicate furniture on Facebook Marketplace, and people came to look at the couch and the dining table and the TV stand. A young couple bought the sectional for $800. A college student took the bookshelf for $50. By the end of the week, we'd sold most of the big pieces and made back about $4,000. It didn't come close to covering what Tom had spent, but it was something. I opened a new bank account in my name only and deposited the money there. I told Tom I was taking over our finances until I could trust him again. He handed over his credit cards and his debit card without arguing. On Thursday, Tom came home from work looking stressed and said his supervisor, Keith Barber, had called him into a meeting. Keith had noticed Tom's performance slipping over the past few months. Missed deadlines, errors in reports that Tom normally wouldn't make. Keith asked if everything was okay at home, or if Tom was dealing with something that was affecting his work. Tom said he'd tried to brush it off at first, but Keith kept pushing. Finally, Tom told him about the Huntington's diagnosis. Keith was quiet for a long time and then asked what Tom needed. Tom said he didn't know yet, but he might need some accommodations as his symptoms got worse. Keith said Tom needed to talk to HR to formalize everything, and they'd need documentation from his doctor. Tom was scared about what disclosing his condition would mean for his job. The HR process took 2 weeks and was more complicated than either of us expected. Tom had to get multiple notes from Dr. McNamara explaining his diagnosis and prognosis. He had to fill out forms about his current limitations and what accommodations he might need in the future. I went with him to the HR meeting and watched him have to explain in detail how the disease would progress and what abilities he would lose. The HR representative was professional, but I could see how much it cost Tom emotionally to admit he was declining. The company approved intermittent FMLA leave and some schedule flexibility so Tom could make it to medical appointments. They said they'd work with him on accommodations as his needs changed. Tom should have felt relieved, but instead he seemed smaller somehow. His pride was hurt by needing special treatment. At our counseling session the following week, Omar asked how we were doing with the homework he'd assigned. Tom had written out a complete timeline of everything. He'd first noticed symptoms almost a year ago. Small things like dropping his keys or forgetting words he knew. The symptoms got worse gradually, and 6 months ago, he finally went to the doctor. The diagnosis came back positive for Huntington's, and that same week, he found the apartment listing online. He'd been going there 3 or 4 times a week ever since. My list of what I needed to rebuild trust was shorter but harder. Complete financial transparency with no hidden accounts or spending. No more secret spaces or activities of any kind. Regular, honest communication about his health and symptoms. Tom read through my list and said he could do all of that. Omar said we also needed individual therapy to process our separate experiences. He recommended a therapist named Michaela Travis for me, who worked with partners of people with chronic illness. Tom agreed to find his own therapist to work through his diagnosis grief separately from our couple's work. I called Michaela that afternoon and got an appointment for the next week. When I walked into her office, I felt like I could finally breathe. She asked me what I was most afraid of, and I realized it wasn't Tom's illness itself. It was the loss of trust and partnership. I didn't know if I could stay married to someone who lied to me, even if his reasons came from fear and pain. Michaela listened without judging and then said something that made me start crying. She said I was grieving multiple losses at once. The future I thought we'd have. The partner I thought Tom was. The version of myself who felt secure in my marriage. She said it was okay to be angry and sad and confused all at the same time. I didn't have to make any big decisions right now about staying or leaving. I could just sit with all these feelings and figure out what I needed one day at a time. I started going to Michaela's office every Tuesday at 4. The sessions helped me see patterns I hadn't noticed before. Tom's need to control everything came from feeling like his body was betraying him. His lies weren't about me at all, even though they hurt me. Michaela asked what I wanted from my marriage now that everything had changed. I told her I wanted a partner who trusted me enough to be honest, even when things were scary. She said that was reasonable and I should tell Tom exactly that. So I did. I sat him down on the couch one evening and explained what honesty meant to me going forward. No hiding symptoms or medical information. No secret spending or accounts. No pretending things were fine when they weren't. Tom listened without interrupting and then said he understood. He'd found his own therapist named Dr. Smith, who specialized in helping people cope with terminal diagnoses. Tom said his first few sessions had been hard because he had to admit out loud that he was dying. Dr. Smith helped him see that the apartment fantasy was his way of trying to control something when his disease made him feel powerless. Tom understood now that it was wrong to shut me out and make decisions for both of us. He promised to do better, but also said changing these patterns would take time. I appreciated his honesty about that. At least he wasn't pretending therapy would fix everything instantly. We had another appointment with Dr. McNamara scheduled for the following week. I cleared my schedule to go with Tom this time. In the waiting room, Tom seemed nervous and kept checking his phone. When we got called back, the nurse took Tom's blood pressure and weight and noted both in his chart. Dr. McNamara came in and asked how Tom was doing with the medication. Tom looked at me and then at the doctor. He admitted he'd only been taking it about half the time because the side effects made him nauseous and tired. Dr. McNamara's face got serious and he explained that consistency was critical for slowing disease progression. Missing doses meant the medication couldn't do its job properly. Tom said he understood, but the side effects were really bad. Dr. McNamara adjusted the prescription to a different formulation that might be easier to tolerate. He also emphasized that Tom needed to report side effects immediately, instead of just stopping the medication on his own. I sat there realizing Tom had been sabotaging his own treatment for weeks. Either he was in denial about needing help, or he was scared of what the medication represented. Maybe both. After the appointment, I told Tom I'd be coming to all his medical visits from now on. He bristled immediately and said he wasn't a child who needed supervision. I kept my voice calm and told him his track record of hiding things meant I couldn't trust him to manage his health alone. He'd lied about symptoms. He'd lied about taking medication. I needed to be there to make sure he was honest with his doctors. Tom's jaw tightened, but he agreed after a long pause. He knew he didn't have much room to argue given everything that had happened. The apartment lease termination took another week to finalize. Bo called to say the paperwork was ready, and we needed to come sign and pay the penalty fee. Tom and I drove to Canyon Ridge on a gray Saturday morning. The complex looked different in daylight, just a normal apartment building instead of the site of my worst discovery. Bo met us in his office and had us sign multiple forms. The penalty was $3,000, which we paid from our already damaged savings account. Bo handed over the security deposit minus charges for cleaning and minor repairs. We got back about $800. Tom held the keys in his hand for a long moment before giving them to Bo. We walked to apartment 67 one last time. Tom unlocked the door and stepped inside. The space was empty now. We'd cleared everything out weeks ago. Just blank walls and carpet and the echo of our footsteps. Tom stood in the middle of the living room looking at the spot where the duplicate couch had been. I watched him say goodbye to something I couldn't see. The fantasy family he'd built here. Emma and James and Sophia, who never existed but felt real to him anyway. After a few minutes, Tom turned and walked out. He pulled the door closed behind him, and we left Canyon Ridge for the last time. That night at home, Tom broke down completely. We were sitting at our real dining table eating takeout when he just started crying. Not quiet tears, but full-body sobs that shook his shoulders. He said he couldn't stop thinking about the children we'd never have. Emma would have been 7 by now. James would be 5. Baby Sophia would be learning to walk. They felt real to him. Letting go of the apartment meant letting go of them, and it felt like losing actual kids. I moved my chair next to his and held him while he cried. I was crying too because I'd been grieving those phantom children as well. Not the specific imaginary kids Tom had created, but the real ones we'd planned to have. The daughter who might have had my eyes. The son who might have had Tom's smile. The family we'd talked about building together. All of that was gone now, or at least impossibly complicated. We sat there crying together for a long time. When Tom finally stopped, he looked exhausted. I got him a glass of water and he drank it slowly. Neither of us said anything else that night. We just went to bed and held each other in the dark. The genetic counseling appointment Dr. McNamara had recommended kept coming up in my mind. I finally brought it up a few days later. Tom and I sat on the couch and talked seriously about whether we wanted to explore IVF with genetic screening. I'd done research and learned the full process cost between $30,000 and $50,000. Insurance wouldn't cover any of it. Plus, the physical process would be hard on me. Hormone injections, egg retrieval, multiple rounds might be needed with no guarantee of success. Tom said he couldn't ask me to go through all that. I told him it should be my choice, not his. We'd both wanted children before his diagnosis. That hadn't changed for me even if the path forward was different now. Tom looked conflicted. He said the money was a huge problem given how much we'd already lost. I agreed but said we should at least learn about our options before deciding anything. Tom finally nodded. I called the genetic counseling center the next morning and scheduled an appointment for 2 weeks out. The first available slot was on a Thursday afternoon. Tom said he'd take off work to come with me. The genetic counselor's office was in a medical building downtown. We checked in and filled out family history forms. The counselor was a woman in her 40s named Dr. Brown. She invited us into her office and asked what brought us in. Tom explained about his Huntington's diagnosis and our concerns about having biological children. Dr. Brown listened carefully and took notes. Then she explained pre-implantation genetic diagnosis in detail. The process involved IVF to create embryos. Before implanting them, they'd test each embryo for the Huntington's gene. Only embryos without the mutation would be transferred to my uterus. This meant we could have biological children with zero risk of passing on the disease. The success rates varied based on my age and other factors, but averaged around 30 to 40% per cycle. Most couples needed 2 or 3 cycles to achieve pregnancy. The cost per cycle was $15,000 to $20,000. Dr. Brown showed us charts and statistics. She explained the physical process I'd go through, the hormone shots, the monitoring appointments, the egg retrieval procedure, the embryo transfer. Tom held my hand while she talked. By the end of the appointment, my head was spinning with information. Dr. Brown gave us a packet of materials to review at home. She said we should take our time deciding and call her if we had questions. Tom and I sat in the car in the parking garage for a while after the appointment. Finally, I asked what he was thinking. Tom said the process seemed overwhelming and expensive. He wasn't sure we could afford it even if we wanted to try. I said I wanted time to think about everything before we decided. We could explore other options too, like adoption, or accepting that we might not have children at all. Tom looked relieved that I wasn't pushing for an immediate decision. We agreed to table the discussion for now and focus on fixing our relationship first. The child question felt urgent, but we couldn't make good decisions while everything between us was still so broken. We drove home in silence. That night, I reread all the materials Dr. Brown had given us. The numbers were scary but not impossible. We'd have to save aggressively and maybe take out a loan, but it could work if we both wanted it badly enough. I still didn't know if I wanted it that badly. Part of me wondered if having children with Tom was even a good idea given how much care he'd need in the future. Our next session with Omar happened 3 days later. Tom and I sat on his couch and Omar asked how we were doing. I explained about the genetic counseling appointment and the conversation we'd had about children. Omar listened and then said something that surprised me. He thought we were trying to solve too many problems at once. The trust issues in our marriage, Tom's health management, the question of children, financial recovery. It was too much to tackle simultaneously. Omar recommended we prioritize. Focus first on rebuilding trust and establishing better communication patterns. Make decisions about children later when our relationship was more stable. Tom and I looked at each other. Omar's suggestion made sense even though the child question felt urgent. We couldn't make good choices about something that big while we were still figuring out if our marriage would survive. We agreed to put the IVF discussion on hold for at least a few months. Omar seemed pleased. He said this showed growth in our ability to work together and make joint decisions. The session felt productive in a way our earlier ones hadn't. Tom went back to work the next week. He'd been taking a lot of time off for appointments, and I could tell his supervisor was getting concerned. Tom tried to focus and do his job well, but the disease was affecting his performance in ways he couldn't always control. On Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang at work. It was Keith from Tom's office. Tom had lost his balance and knocked over a filing cabinet. He wasn't hurt, but he was really shaken up. Keith thought someone should come get him. I left work immediately and drove to Tom's office. I found him sitting in a conference room looking pale. The filing cabinet was back upright, but papers were still scattered across the floor. Tom stood up when he saw me and tried to act like everything was fine. I could see his hands shaking, though. We thanked Keith and I drove Tom home. In the car, Tom finally admitted how scared he was. He said losing his balance at work made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. He was terrified of losing his independence, of not being able to do his job, of becoming a burden to me. I didn't know what to say to that. I was scared too. That night, we sat on our bed with all the lights off except the lamp on my nightstand. Tom asked what I was thinking and I told him the truth. I was scared I wouldn't be strong enough to take care of him when things got really bad. The disease would take away more and more of him until he needed help with everything, and I didn't know if I could handle that. Tom nodded slowly and said he understood if I wanted to leave. I looked at him sitting there in the dim light and said I wasn't leaving right now, but I couldn't promise I'd stay forever. The honesty hurt both of us, but it felt necessary. We sat there for a long time not saying anything else because there wasn't anything else to say. Neither of us knew what our future looked like anymore. 2 days later, I had my session with Michaela. I told her about the conversation with Tom and how guilty I felt for not being sure I could stay married to him long term. Michaela leaned forward in her chair and said something that surprised me. She said it was okay to know my limits. Staying in a marriage because I felt obligated instead of genuinely committed wasn't healthy for either of us. I needed to figure out what I actually wanted separate from what I thought I should want. The permission to consider leaving without being a terrible person made me cry. Michaela handed me tissues and we spent the rest of the session talking about how to separate Tom's illness from Tom's choices, and what I owed him versus what I owed myself. The next evening, Tom's phone rang while we were making dinner. It was his mom Alina asking why they hadn't seen us in months. Tom made excuses about being busy with work, and I could hear the hurt in Alina's voice through the phone. After he hung up, I told him his parents deserved to know about his diagnosis. Tom said he didn't want to worry them, but I pointed out they were already worried because he was avoiding them. We argued about it for 20 minutes before Tom finally agreed to have them visit that weekend and tell them together. He looked sick about it, but he made the call and invited them to come Saturday. When Saturday came, I cleaned the house nervously while Tom paced around checking things that didn't need checking. Alina and Luca arrived at noon with a casserole and a bag of Tom's favorite cookies from his childhood. We all sat in the living room making small talk for about 10 minutes before Tom said he had something to tell them. His voice shook when he explained about the Huntington's diagnosis. Alina started crying immediately, and Luca's face went completely white. They both asked why Tom hadn't told them sooner, and Tom said he was ashamed. He didn't want them to see him as broken or dying. Alina reached over and grabbed Tom's hands and said they were his parents. Worrying about him was their job, and he should have let them help carry this. Luca asked detailed questions about Tom's prognosis and treatment plan. I watched him process the information the same way Tom did, needing to understand every detail and timeline. I could see where Tom got his need to control and manage everything. Alina wanted to know how she and Luca could help and what we needed from them. Tom admitted he needed support, but didn't know what form that should take. We all agreed to stay in closer contact and be more honest with each other going forward. Luca said they'd come visit more often, and Alina said Tom should call her anytime he needed to talk. Before they left, Alina hugged me tight and whispered that I should call her too if I ever needed anything. After Tom's parents drove away that evening, Tom seemed different somehow. Lighter, maybe. Like telling them had lifted weight off his shoulders that he didn't know he was carrying. He said he wished he'd told them months ago instead of dealing with everything alone. I pointed out that this was exactly why his secret about the apartment had hurt me so much. Isolation made everything harder and scarier. Tom nodded and said he was starting to understand that. He asked if I thought his parents would really help, or if they'd just worry from a distance. I told him I thought Alina would call him every day, and Luca would research Huntington's until he knew more than the doctors. Our next session with Omar happened on Wednesday. Omar asked us to talk about what we needed from each other moving forward. I said I needed complete honesty even when the truth was hard or scary. No more protecting me from reality by hiding things. Tom said he needed patience while he learned to be vulnerable instead of protective. Omar said these were reasonable needs and asked us to practice small moments of honesty and patience every day. He gave us homework to share one difficult truth each day, no matter how small. Tom agreed, but I could tell the idea made him uncomfortable. The following Monday, Tom came home early from work looking devastated. He'd gotten his performance review and it wasn't good. His supervisor, Keith, had documented all the errors and missed deadlines from the past months. Keith was understanding about the medical situation, but he said Tom needed to decide if he could still do his job effectively. The company couldn't keep covering for mistakes that affected clients and other team members. Tom might need to consider disability leave. Tom sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands and said the idea of leaving work felt like giving up. I sat next to him and said it wasn't giving up. It was being realistic about what he could handle right now. Bianca gave me the name of a disability lawyer she knew, and I made an appointment for the next week. Tom and I met with the lawyer in his office downtown. The lawyer explained that Tom's diagnosis qualified him for long-term disability insurance through his employer and eventually for Social Security. The application process was long, though, and approval wasn't guaranteed. Tom would need extensive medical documentation, and it could take months to get approved. Tom resisted the idea of applying and said it felt like admitting defeat. I told him it was being practical and planning ahead. The lawyer gave us a folder of forms to fill out and said to call him when we were ready to start the process. That weekend, I found a support group for partners of people with Huntington's disease. The group met at a community center on Thursday evenings and was run by a woman named Lainey Ferguson. Lainey had been taking care of her husband for 8 years and knew everything about managing the disease progression. I went to my first meeting feeling nervous, but everyone there understood exactly what I was going through. Hearing other people's stories helped me feel less alone in my fear and confusion. Lainey gave practical advice about setting up care systems and maintaining my own identity separate from being a caregiver. After the meeting ended, I signed up to come every week. On the drive home, I felt like I'd found people who could help me figure out how to do this impossible thing I wasn't sure I could do. Our 4th wedding anniversary came 2 weeks after I started going to the support group. We didn't make reservations anywhere fancy or plan anything big. Tom picked up Chinese food from the place near his office, and I rented a movie neither of us had seen before. We ate on the couch with the containers spread across the coffee table, and I realized this felt more real than our first anniversary when we'd gone to that expensive restaurant and pretended everything was perfect. Tom handed me a card after we finished eating. Inside, he'd written 3 paragraphs about the apartment and how sorry he was for lying. He promised to be honest going forward even when the truth scared him. He said he knew trust took time to rebuild and he'd wait as long as I needed. I folded the card closed and told him I was choosing to stay and work on us. Not because I had to or because leaving felt too hard, but because I wanted to see if we could build something better than what we'd had before. Tom's eyes got wet and he nodded and we watched the movie without talking much. The next month, we fell into new patterns that felt strange at first, but gradually became normal. Tom had doctor appointments every other Tuesday, and I went with him to all of them. I had support group on Thursday evenings and individual therapy with Michaela on Monday afternoons. We did couples counseling with Omar on Wednesday mornings before work. Our calendars filled up with medical stuff and mental health stuff until it felt like managing Tom's illness was a full-time job on top of our actual jobs. But something was shifting between us. Tom started taking his medication at the same time every morning, and he'd tell me when he noticed symptoms getting worse instead of hiding them. He'd say his hands felt shaky or he was having trouble concentrating, and I'd just listen instead of trying to fix it. I told him when I felt angry about the apartment money or scared about the future, and he'd sit with those feelings instead of getting defensive. We were learning how to be honest in small ways every single day. 3 months after I found the apartment, we drove past Canyon Ridge on our way to one of Tom's appointments. I looked at the building as we went by, and it just looked like an apartment complex. Not the place where Tom had built a fantasy life or where I discovered his secrets. Just a regular building with regular people living regular lives inside. Tom reached across the center console and took my hand. I held on and kept my eyes forward on the road ahead of us. We had another appointment to get to, and then therapy after that, and probably take out for dinner because neither of us felt like cooking. One honest day at a time. Real talk. How many of you have secrets from your partner right now that you're justifying as protection? No judgment. Just curious how common this actually is. Comment honestly and hit subscribe for more conversations that get real. Are you hiding something?